We're now going to hear from Howard Gayton on Commedia dell'arte, a subject upon which he is hugely knowledgeable and experienced as scholar, director, performer, teacher for over 20 years, specializing in this particular form of Italian play that so influenced Shakespeare. He has run several Commedia acting companies, including his present venture, the Columbina Theatre Company, which he runs with writer and poet Peter Oswald, who once held Shakespeare's job as writer-in-residence at the Globe. So a warm welcome then to Howard Gayton.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Venice, where we lay our scene. In this talk, I will introduce the theatre form of Commedia dell'arte. I will attempt to explain what Commedia is, give a brief history of its development in the Italian Renaissance up to the present, and set it within the context of Shakespeare's time, and explain why I think it's important and how Commedia functions in terms of characters and plots. So Commedia translates as the acting of skill or professional theatre. It's important in theatre history because Commedia was the first professional theatre. In 1545 in Padua, there's the first signed contract of a theatre company. Now, before that, theatre was carried out via guilds or under the regis of various lords or princes. We know that in England, for example, the Chamberlain's men or the King's men. So this was a very important departure in terms of theatre. As part of the rise of the merchants and capitalism, in a way, that Renaissance Italy forged, and particularly in Venice, actors became professionals. Now, Commedia was developed in the furnace of the Venetian Republic, and as a result, it contains within it a good deal of influences from humanist and other esoteric Renaissance thought. It was primarily an improvised form of theatre, and its roots are kind of unclear. The general belief is it was born from a mix of the courtly amateur written drama of the Commedia erudita, and that was mixed with the rough and ready street theatre of the mountebanks, with their masks and folk roots. Now, if the erudita look back to Greek and Roman influences for plot lines and story and character, then the leather masks of the Commedia, such as this fine example, Pulcinella, it's one of the distinctive features of Commedia, the masks. They would have come from the folk traditions that would have been preserved undocumented from the more pagan rites of the Roman theatre and folk pageants. So from its birth in the Venetian Republic, Commedia spread throughout Europe. Troupes of performers became popular amongst the courts and in the marketplaces of Germany, of what we now know as Czech Republic, such as in Prague, right down into the Iberian Peninsula, and especially in France, where it was known as the Italian comedy, and then through the plays of Molière became the Commedia Française. I've just realized in hearing that this is all about music, that of course Commedia was the root of opera. There was so much music in Commedia, and opera was developed out of Commedia. So Commedia had spread into France in the sort of 17th and 18th centuries. Very influential on Molière, French playwrights, and in the French courts. And at the turn of the 20th century, Commedia was a major influence on Meyerhold, who's a Russian dramaturg. He worked under Stanislavski and then separated from Stanislavski. And Meyerhold had a particular interest in Harlequin and his magical and mercurial properties. Talking of Hermes, Harlequin is often seen as being kind of Hermes, hermetic in his characteristics. And this development from Meyerhold can be seen as one of the forefathers of physical comedy in Western theatre. He broke away from the more cerebral Stanislavskian approach to theatre to find other means of physical and visual expression. Commedia influenced the great German playwright and director Brecht, helping him to find non-naturalistic means of expression for his actors. And after the Second World War, in order to cement a culture for the newly formed Italian state, the mask maker Sartori, the playwright Dario Fo, and the great movement teacher Jacques Lecoq were tasked with recreating commedia in Italy from the pictures and scenarios that were extant. So yet again, commedia exerted an influence on Western theatre, and again in this more physical theatre route. I mean, think of Lecoq's influence was huge, particularly in England, particularly in the 1980s, where he influenced companies like Complicité, and this massive physical explosion of physical theatre in the UK. As a side note, because I'm a Punch and Judy professor as well, working summer seasons on the seafront in Teignmouth every year, our English Mr. Punch has his roots in commedia. Here he is, Mr. Punch. He has his roots in the character of Porcinello, mixed in with kind of English jesters and clowns, such as William Kemp. And of course, pantomime developed out of this commedia, and the touring seaside Pierrot troupes, which were huge on seasides in the earlier 20th century, they came out of commedia as well. So commedia is hugely influential. So this brings me on to this thing. Why is commedia important in the context of the works attributed to Shakespeare? If one thinks of there being a style or genre of theatre which can be called Shakespearean, one can see it's lasted with numerous reinventions for nearly 500 years. And this is also true of Commedia dell'arte. And I can't think of any other form of Western theatre which has lasted in this way. There are revivals of Reformation theatre, and theatre forms grow out of other forms, but there's something about the works attributed to Shakespeare and of Commedia that keep reinventing themselves and keep being able to teach us something about ourselves and our societies, even as we outwardly seem to progress. I suggest that one of the reasons for this is that both these forms of theatre have deeply entwined archetypal themes which transcend the mundane, but which are also tied so closely to the personal and to common human desires and humanist themes that somehow they're both timeless and yet very much of the time, whenever that time happens to be. In Midsummer Night's Dream, the archetypal world of Titania and Oberon are set against the groundlings of Bottom and other rude mechanicals. And of course, there are the lovers. And this is so typical of Commedia too. The masks and some of the themes of the stories in Commedia plots that are set within an archetypal world, but the flawed characters have all the elements that make us human: jealousies, love, passions, obsession, stupidity. I think it's the mix of these deep archetypes and very real human concerns that has seen these two genres continually reinvent themselves over time. So how does Commedia function? It's traditionally non-scripted, which means it's semi-improvised. If the original Commedia companies were formed from actors who performed in the Commedia erudita, they would have had many poetic scenarios, especially love scenes, which they could draw on. These became known as lazzi, little scenes which could be called upon if the moment seemed right. Added to this would be physical lazzi of the pratfalls and sight gags, which again could be called upon when the moment arose, which came out of the street theatre performances. Since companies stayed together for long periods of time, actors would often take on roles for a whole lifetime. They would get to know their characters and the other actors' characters so well that they could quite easily improvise. Because of the improvisational nature of Commedia, it hasn't left much in the way of texts, but Flaminio Scala compiled some scenarios in 1611. This is an example of a scene in a Commedia play. So this is what you get if you're an actor. It's called The Tragic Events, Act 1, the city of Florence, Oratio and Flavio. The disguised Oratio arrives in Florence with Flavio, his friend from Rome. He tells Flavio that it has been a month since he killed, in his city of Florence, a captain, son of a doctor, who is an old enemy of his family and whose daughter he loves very much. He adds that he has returned to find out if Isabella still loves him, and Flavio promises to help in every way possible. They knock on the door of the inn. So that's what the actors have to play with, just the bare bones of the scene. And that would develop live depending on the audience and how the actors felt that night. One night a scene might have a new game or a known Lazzi. Another night it might be more perfunctory. I think of it as, if you think of it like playing jazz. So there's a tune which the players know. Some nights the muse takes the players and they add in riffs and extras from their repertoire, or they might even invent something entirely new. To look further into the structure of commedia, we now turn to the characters who drive the plots. Often in commedia plots, as in the scene above, there are two main households, both alike in dignity, perhaps not. Perhaps both alike in infamy might be more appropriate. So the way I see it, if you imagine an Italian piazza, the Italian sun is beating down, and either side of this piazza are two tall houses, one dressed in gaudy gold decorations and the other somewhat crumbling. And each of these households has a family with a head of the family, children and servants. I'm just going to take a slight diversion here to look at the relationships within each household and the relationships that households to each other, because there's two images that I find useful when I'm teaching commedia. There's actually the Kabbalah tree of life, the Sephirot of the Kabbalah, and the relationships in Romeo and Juliet. They seem to merge very well. I'm mask maker of my old commedia company, Offerboom, a man called Ninian Kinnear Wilson, who unfortunately died a few years ago, wants to merge after about a year of being out of touch to expound the idea that commedia has embedded within it Renaissance understanding of the Kabbalic tree of life. He pointed out that the form developed within the courts of the Medici and in the Renaissance, for whom we know the esoteric was an obsession. And I found it really useful to picture these two households in that way. It helps to see the relationships of the characters. Now at the top, you have the Kether, or the crown. In Romeo and Juliet, this is Paris. In Midsummer Night's Dream, this is Theseus. In Commedia, this is Magnifico. Magnifico, like a king or prince or president, is almost more of a role than a character. The person is subsumed within the deep archetype of what it is to be that. Now, below this head of the city are two pillars. These are the two households, two families, the owners of the aforementioned houses. In the gaudy house is Signor Pantalone, literally Mr. Trousers. And he is a merchant, representing the rise of the merchant classes in the Renaissance Italy.
And my character is that of a miser or a schemer for money, or both. I am old in Renaissance terms, lecherous, a cockerel. I preen myself and show off. Now, normally I have money, though I can fall on hard times, especially if my ships have been lost at sea or attacked by pirates. I am nouveau riche, hence the gaudy decorations.
In the house opposite, there is Il Dottore, maybe a doctor of law, maybe of medicine.
I am verbose and rotund, a lover of food and of spouting information. Any information, preferably with sprinklings of Latin, ipso facto ergo sum quod amo amat, to prove my point. One can imagine, like so many landed families, that my wealth is all in property, which is, of course, falling down.
Now, commonly, there is a lot of animosity between these two. Perhaps Signor Dottore needs to borrow money from the crass Pantalone, and Pantalone wants to rise his family's prestige by marrying into the doctor's line, either marrying himself to the doctor's daughter, or perhaps marrying his daughter to one of Il Dottore's sons. Now, these children are commonly known as gli innamorati, the lovers, or first and second actors. In this structure, which we're envisaging with these pillars below the head of the household, they lie just below, first actors just below, and then second actors, the younger lovers below them. And they have their own intrigues and plots, which either directly or indirectly impact their fathers. Maybe like Romeo and Juliet, the younger children are in love, but the parents won't let them marry, so they plan to elope. or maybe the older children, or first actors as they're known, fall in love with each other or fall out of love with each other and decide to take revenge. Under these characters, with their madness, obsessions, loves and desires, we then have the servants, or Zani, probably a shortened version of Giovanni, John. These long-nosed masks are migrants who, like Shakespeare's naive clowns, have come into the city looking for work.
We are lazy, hungry, lustful idiots, but we can be a very useful tool for complication of plot points. For example, confusion of letters.
Now, there are some servants who are more wily. Maybe they're like Shakespearean fools, for example. You have the coquettish, intelligent Columbina, who can run rings around Pantalone, and are often would-be lover, the quick-witted, acrobatic Harlequin. An interesting side note, one of the distinctive things about commedia is that unlike in England, women performed on stage, though they were not traditionally those of mask roles. So this is how I picture the basic commedia structure then. 2 households with master, children of various ages and agency, and servants of various levels of wit. Somehow their interconnecting wishes, desires and obsessions sort of seem to function. And then the outsider enters the town, bringing chaos in his or her wake. Often a capitano, and often a Spanish capitano, because the Iberian mercenaries roamed around Italy at the time.
The Capitano is a cowardly, womanizing, heavy-drinking braggart. Imagine that I have been traveling up the coast, leaving gambling debts, chaos and burning towns in my wake. Off to war, or rather, to drink.
The above description of characters, I'm sure, will lead to various comparisons of Shakespeare's characters. Falstaff, perhaps, as the captain, or Sir Toby Belch. What about the rude mechanicals as Zani, and Hermione, Hermia, Lysander, and Demetrius as Innamorati? And Harlequin as Puck, perhaps, and of course, Pantalone as Shylock. So there are character influences on Shakespeare, and there are clearly plot influences on Shakespeare. How did he come across these influences? So there's evidence in the 1570s of commedia troupes coming to England. And of course, we know, unlike Dominic Raab, that there has always been exchange of goods and ideas between England and continental Europe across the English Channel. And there would have been cultural ideas, particularly coming through France, where commedia was starting to put down deep roots. There is evidence of commedia troupes performing in the Elizabethan court in 1573 and 74. And in 1574, the Lord Mayor granted passports for commedia players. The Vagabond Act of 1572, which meant that players had to be attached to lords, was perhaps partly in response to the Italian players who, like in France, were threatening to replace homegrown actors because they were so popular. The love of the Italian style of theatre, as well as other types of art, waxed and waned over the course of the 16th century. There's no doubt that through the 16th century, English playwrights were influenced by all things Italian, and at times they were heavily criticised for copying the crassness, even if it was popular with audiences. So it's no wonder that there seems so many comparisons within Shakespeare's work and commedia. The question is why and how. Now, perhaps the writer of Shakespearean plays saw commedia in England. That's certainly possible. While there isn't evidence of wide touring of commedia companies in England, as there is on the continent, there is some. Perhaps Shakespeare worked with English actors who had performed in France and Italy and learnt the Italian style, such as the actor Munday, who worked for a while with Oxford's men and who in 1579 visited Naples, Venice and Padua and was known to perform ad lib in the Italian style. There's no doubt that throughout the 16th century, English playwrights were influenced by all things Italian, but perhaps the writer of the works attributed to Shakespeare spent a good deal of time in Italy, watching the Commedia Erudita and the Commedia dell'arte in its natural home. Perhaps there were plot ideas and vibrant characters, and there was an understanding of the archetypal and hermetic nature of these works of theatre, which were brought back to the Elizabethan court through someone who had deep knowledge and connection to the Italian courts. It is certainly an intriguing possibility. Thank you.
Howard, that was absolutely wonderful. And thank you very much, and very funny. And how brilliant those masks are, that you just put them on and they only cover a small part of your face, and yet you completely transform into Capitano, into whoever those people are. That's absolutely wonderful. And I have to say that the comments that have been springing up as you were making that fine talk were all hugely happy, positive, and excited by it. So I hope we will hear more of you in future, and that was a wonderful contribution to our conference. Thank you very much indeed.